If she doesn't wake up, everything will finally be simpler. I heard that sentence when everyone thought I couldn't hear anything anymore. There was no crying, no panic, just a very calm voice. So calm it was almost a relief. And that's what sent a chill through me. It wasn't because they were talking about me, but because of the way they said it, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. There was a pause right after, and no one corrected the statement, no one denied it. There was only the soft scrape of a chair on the floor, and a tiny sound like a pen touching paper. I couldn't open my eyes, and I couldn't move, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Everything had been arranged beforehand. Not just now, not tonight, but a long time ago, in places I couldn't see and in decisions I had once thought were harmless. And if I hadn't woken up at that moment, I might have gone my whole life without ever knowing what they meant by simpler. I live in Portland, Oregon, a city where mornings usually start slow, as if everything needs a few extra minutes to really wake up. My kitchen always smelled of freshly brewed coffee, but I rarely finished a cup while it was still hot. It would usually sit there, on the corner of the wooden table, slowly going cold while I moved on to checking emails on my phone. The unread subject lines piled up, my work schedule was packed from the start of the day to the end of the week, and I was used to sorting it all out before I walked out the door. I'm the kind of person whose life revolves around stability. At work, I was the one who handled situations others didn't want to touch. At home, I was the one who remembered everything, from paying the bills to appointments that, if forgotten, would throw the whole week into chaos. I don't like conflict. Not because I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but because I've always believed that keeping things peaceful was more important than proving who was right. Marcus used to say I was the one who made everything easy. He'd say it with a gentle smile, like a compliment, and for a very long time I believed him. I didn't realize that some things are easy, not because they're simple, but because someone is silently shouldering all the complicated parts. There were times I almost asked. Times when an email would appear that I didn't remember agreeing to. Times when a document was placed in front of me with the explanation that I just needed to sign it to get things done faster. I'd look at the words a little longer than usual, long enough to feel that something wasn't quite right. Then I'd convince myself I was probably overthinking it. I'm not an easy person to fool. I was just someone who always tried to keep the peace. And sometimes, to keep that peace, I learned to ignore the questions I should have asked a long time ago. The changes didn't happen all at once. They appeared in small ways, small enough that you could overlook them without feeling like you were overlooking anything important. Marcus started talking more about our finances. At first, it was just simple things, like how he would review a few payments to keep things tidier, or how he would consolidate the accounts to make them easier to manage. He said it with that familiar certainty, the same way he always talked about things he believed were right. I didn't object. In fact, I felt a little relieved to have someone share the work I was used to handling on my own. Then came the papers. Not complicated things at first, just forms, small updates, things he said needed a signature to complete some process. He'd put a pen in my hand, point to the line I needed to sign, and say he just wanted to make things simpler for me. I signed. Not because I didn't understand, but because I trusted that if it were anything important, he would have explained it clearly. Lena Voss showed up after that, in a way that made perfect sense. She was their legal support, the one who helped Marcus with paperwork when needed. She spoke clearly and calmly, always explaining just enough to make things sound reasonable, without getting into the details. Whenever Lena was there, the conversations about paperwork became quicker, shorter. Fewer questions were asked. I did notice. Not right away, but there were moments I realized Lena tended to be present at the exact times a decision needed to be made. She never interrupted or pushed. She just stood there as a natural part of the process, as if her presence was just a given. One time, I held a document for longer than usual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the surface, but there was a faint, hard-to-name feeling, as if there was a detail I didn't fully grasp. Marcus looked at me, smiled, and said we were just simplifying things, no big changes. Lena stood beside him, giving a slight nod. I could have asked more questions. I could have read it more carefully. I could have said I needed time, but I didn't. It wasn't because I wasn't smart enough to understand. It was because I didn't want to turn a normal moment into an argument. I chose to believe that everything was fine, because keeping things peaceful just seemed more important at the time than digging into a vague feeling. People don't get deceived because they don't understand. They get deceived because they choose to believe in what makes them feel safer. And sometimes that safety is just a temporary silence you create for yourself. That day didn't start any differently than the ones before. I left home a little late, my coffee half cold, my phone buzzing nonstop with unanswered emails. Portland had a light rain, the kind that makes the roads slick, but not enough to make anyone actually slow down. I remember thinking that if I could just get through the morning, everything would be okay. The accident was fast and quiet, a sudden break up ahead, a brief moment of lost control, and then everything stopped in a way no one was prepared for. There wasn't a loud crash like in the movies, just a sharp jolt, a dizzying sensation, and then the chaos of surrounding sounds. I was still conscious, but my body wasn't responding normally. Someone was tapping on the window. A voice asked if I could hear them, and my own response felt a few beats behind me. I was taken to the hospital with a series of diagnoses that weren't too serious on their own, but were dangerous enough when added together. The doctor said they needed to intervene immediately to prevent complications. There was no time to think too much. I signed a few papers while my mind was still foggy, and then everything turned to the white of an operating room. The first time I opened my eyes after that, I couldn't really open them. I just sensed that I was in a different place, where the light was steadier and the sounds were kept at a moderate level. There were footsteps passing by, the steady hum of machines, and long stretches of silence between those sounds. Marcus was in the hallway. I knew it not because I saw him, but because I recognized his voice when he spoke to someone. His tone was the same as always. Controlled, clear, not a hint of panic. Next to him was Cynthia, his mother, a woman who always kept a certain distance from her emotions, even in situations that should have called for more. And Lena was there too, not as an outsider, but as part of a group that was used to standing together during important decisions. No one was crying loudly. No one was frantically calling my name. There were just short exchanges, questions that got straight to the point, and pauses just long enough to wait for an answer. Everything moved at a very steady, orderly rhythm, as if they were waiting for a result that had already been calculated and just needed time to confirm it. What made me realize something was wrong wasn't the silence, but the way they existed within it. There was no urgency, no wasted movements. Just a calculated waiting, where each person seemed to already know what they were waiting for, and it wasn't entirely about whether I would wake up or not. I don't know how long I lay there. Time in a hospital doesn't pass in a normal way. There are no clear mornings or evenings, just alternating periods of light and dark, repetitive sounds, and the feeling that your body doesn't quite belong to you. At one point, everything around me grew quieter than usual. Not completely silent, but the kind of quiet that makes the smallest sounds perfectly clear. The soft tap of shoes on the floor, the click of a closing door, and then the voices. I couldn't open my eyes, but I heard everything. The insurance payout will be processed within 30 days. That voice wasn't a doctor's. It definitely wasn't. It had a familiarity that told me who was speaking without me having to see. There was a short pause, as if the other person was double-checking something. The transfer is already complete. Another voice replied, lower, more cautious, but with no surprise. There were no questions like, "Are you sure?" or "Are there any problems?" Just confirmation, as if this was one part of a sequence that had been planned long ago. Everything was already signed last quarter. That sentence was spoken so softly that if I hadn't been concentrating, I might have missed it. But I didn't miss it. Not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because in that moment, it was the only thing I could do. Listen, last quarter. Not last week. Not yesterday. 3 months ago, when I was still perfectly healthy, still going to work every day, still sitting at my kitchen table with my cooling coffee, believing my life was on the right track. I didn't need to hear the whole conversation to understand what they were talking about. All it took were those small pieces, fitting together slowly, clearly. Insurance payout. Transfer complete. Already signed last quarter. None of it was sudden. None of it was a reaction to the current situation. All of it had existed before this, silently, methodically, while I still thought everything was the same. I didn't feel shocked, not in the way you'd imagine. There wasn't some explosive moment in my head. It was just this strange, quiet feeling, as if a layer of something had just been peeled back, revealing something that had been there all along. The biggest betrayal isn't a single act. It's not one decision made on one day. It's in the length of time it existed without you knowing. In all those perfectly normal days where you were still laughing, still trusting, still living your life, while somewhere else the story was already being rewritten in a completely different direction. And when you finally see it, the most painful part isn't what they did, it's how long it was going on, and that you were there the whole time, completely unaware. After those words settled, my mind wasn't empty like I thought it would be. On the contrary, things started connecting, very slowly, but very surely. It wasn't one big memory that burst forward, but tiny pieces, details I had seen before and just let go. I remembered the emails that had once appeared in my inbox. The subject lines sounded vaguely familiar, but not important enough to open right then. I'd even meant to go back and look at them once, but then a meeting got in the way, another call came through, and I told myself I'd do it later. And then there was no later. Those emails sank down, disappearing among hundreds of other notifications, and I never went back. I remembered the electronic signatures. The times Marcus would hand me his phone, point to a little box on the screen, and say all I had to do was confirm. I did it so naturally, almost out of habit, not because I didn't read, but because I trusted that if there was something to explain, he would explain it. And when there was no explanation, I took it in the simplest way possible, that everything was fine. I remembered our joint account. At first, it was for convenience, so we wouldn't have to split every little expense, to keep things tidy. I'd seen small changes, numbers shifting in ways I couldn't quite keep up with, but never big enough to become a problem. I had gotten used to trusting that a system was running smoothly, and I didn't need to check every detail to prove it. All of those things were completely normal on their own. Each one had a reasonable cause, an explanation that was enough for me not to ask any more questions. But when they were all lined up next to each other in that moment, they were no longer separate pieces. They became a complete picture, and the most terrifying part was that the picture had existed for a very long time. I didn't lose everything tonight. I didn't lose my life in an accident or on an operating table. I had lost it gradually in the small decisions I thought were insignificant, in the times I chose to trust instead of to check, in the moments I knew I should have paused but just kept walking past. And when I realized that, the feeling wasn't panic. It was more like a truth that had been there all along, and I just hadn't been ready to look it in the eye. A truth so simple it was hard to accept. No one can take your life from you if you haven't already handed it over. When I first opened my eyes, the light in the room hadn't changed much. Everything was still moving at its own pace, steady, regular, as if nothing had really happened. Only my body felt different. A little heavier, a little slower, but enough for me to know I was back. Marcus was the first one to come closer. He said my name the right way, with the right tone, just like a worried husband should. His hand on mine was warm and steady, not a tremor. Cynthia stood behind him, her gaze lingering on me a bit longer than usual, but with no emotional breakdown. Lena stood off to the side, keeping just enough distance, as if she already knew her place in this scene. If you were looking from the outside, nothing was wrong. Everything was correct. The right words, the right gestures, the right distances. They were playing their parts so well. I could have asked right away. I could have said what I'd heard. I could have let my emotions spill out the way anyone in my position would have. But I did none of those things. I didn't ask. I didn't cry. I didn't react. I looked at Marcus when he spoke, but I didn't try to find answers in his eyes. I heard every word, but I didn't interrupt to argue. I gave a slight nod when I needed to, keeping everything just enough so that no one would suspect a thing. Because in that moment, I understood something I'd never really understood before. Sometimes, reacting immediately isn't strength. It's just the fastest way to show all your cards, while everyone else is still holding theirs. I chose to observe. I memorized every small detail. The way Marcus avoided certain words. The way Cynthia didn't ask the questions she should have. The way Lena stood there like someone who already knew the script but didn't need to say it out loud. I waited. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't fully understand what was happening, but because I knew that if I wanted to see the whole picture, I couldn't let shatter too soon. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who reacts the fastest. The strongest person is the one who knows when to hold that reaction back, to have enough time to see things more clearly than anyone thinks you can. The next few days passed at a very slow pace, slow enough for me to notice everything I'd never paid attention to before. I didn't rush to say anything. I kept my answers short, just enough so that no one had to ask follow-up questions, and I spent the rest of the time thinking. Dr. Alina Mercer was the only one who looked at me for a beat longer. It wasn't a probing look, but the kind of look from someone who understands that something has changed, even if it hasn't been said out loud. When she asked if I needed any additional support, I didn't answer right away. I just asked a very simple question back. If I needed to speak with a lawyer, could the hospital help connect me with one? She wasn't surprised. She nodded, as if it were a perfectly reasonable request under the circumstances. She didn't ask why, didn't offer advice. She simply said she would arrange it. The meeting was brief. I didn't tell the whole story, just gave him what was necessary. My name, my marital status, a few details about our assets, and what I suspected had been changed without my knowledge. The lawyer didn't seem to rush to any conclusions. He just asked a few more questions, requested some documents, and said he needed to review the entire ownership structure before making any judgments. In the days that followed, I started reviewing everything in a way I never had before. Not with emotion, but with data. The joint accounts, the insurance policies, the property deeds. Each one was a small piece, nothing big enough to be shocking on its own, but enough to form a clear path if you looked long enough. Marcus wasn't wrong when he said everything had been arranged. He just didn't tell the whole story. Some parts were already finalized, some assets had been transferred, but there were also things still pending. Conditions that hadn't been triggered, processes that needed more time, or a final signature to be complete. And right there, that's where I saw the opening. It wasn't a huge mistake, not an obvious flaw, just a loose end that hadn't been tied up, a condition that hadn't been fully met. A detail so small that if you didn't have a good reason to look for it, you probably would never have noticed it. But when you know what you're looking for, those small details start to mean something. I didn't change my behavior. I kept everything the same, still talked to Marcus in a normal way, still let everything play out just as they thought it was. But underneath all of that, I had started to rearrange the pieces. Not to strike back immediately, but to make sure that when I walked out of this situation, I wouldn't just understand what had happened, but I would also know exactly where I stood. And for the first time since I woke up, I realized this story might not end the way they had planned. Marcus came back on the afternoon of the 5th day carrying a carefully wrapped bouquet of flowers, the kind he knew I always liked, with fresh stems that had been chosen carefully. He paused at the door for a beat before coming in, as if he needed to prepare for this moment, then said my name in a voice that was deeper and slower than usual. I looked at him, not avoiding his eyes, not seeming to be in any hurry. I just told him to sit down. He placed the bouquet on the table by the window, pulled a chair closer to the bed, and began to speak. The apology came first, in the right order, in the right way, not missing a single element of a well-rehearsed apology. Then came the explanation, longer, more detailed, with reasons that would have sounded plausible on their own. I didn't interrupt. I let him say everything, one sentence at a time. I let the silences between his sentences stretch, just long enough for him to fill them with the next explanation. I didn't nod much, nor did I react in a way that would make him change his rhythm. I just listened. When he finally stopped, the room felt a little quieter. The monitor was still beeping steadily. The light was the same. Nothing on the outside had changed. I looked at him for another second, just to be sure he was finished, and then I began. I didn't speak quickly. I chose each sentence carefully, keeping my voice as steady as I possibly could. I told him about what I'd heard in the hallway, the words he thought I couldn't hear. I repeated his exact phrasing, adding nothing, taking nothing away. I talked about the documents I had signed, the dates they were processed, and the changes that were made before I ever came to the hospital. I didn't ask him if he did it. I stated what happened as facts that were now laid out in front of us both. Marcus tried to interrupt at one point, but I just looked at him and kept talking, without raising my voice, without applying any pressure, just keeping my own rhythm. I spoke about the unfinished terms, the transfers that hadn't been closed, and the details he had overlooked, thinking everything was already settled. I didn't need to explain much. Everything that needed to be said was in those details. The room didn't have a climax in the way people usually think. There were no loud voices, no heavy words thrown back and forth. There was only the truth, laid out piece by piece, clear and undeniable. Marcus wasn't speaking as quickly as before. He paused more between his sentences, as if he was trying to rearrange what he thought was certain. The bouquet of flowers on the table was still there, but no one was looking at it anymore. I didn't draw the conclusion for him. I didn't ask for a new explanation. I just stopped when I had said everything I needed to say. And in the quiet that followed, without anything more needing to be said, we both knew that this story was no longer going the way he had planned. Marcus was used to things going according to his plan. The way he spoke, the way he arranged his words, and the way he fell silent at just the right moment all showed that he believed he had gone far enough not to have to worry about the remaining parts. Even after I finished speaking, he maintained a certain composure, as if what I had just laid out were merely minor details he hadn't gotten around to explaining, not something that could change the outcome. He repeated that everything had already been handled. The documents were signed, the funds were transferred, the adjustments were completed according to procedure. He didn't say outright that it was all over, but his choice of words showed that he believed it was. I didn't argue with him about those parts. I just reminded him of one detail he had overlooked or perhaps had underestimated from the beginning, a legal condition that had not been activated. Not because of missing paperwork, but because of a missing element that he couldn't decide on his own. It was a clause that had been put in place from the start, not prominent, not attention-grabbing, but enough to retain a piece of control until all conditions were fully met. I spoke slowly, letting each word hang in the air long enough before it reached his ears. I didn't need to explain too much. I just needed to point to the exact spot where the entire structure he had built was not yet truly complete. There was also an asset that he hadn't included in the chain of transfers. Not because he didn't know about it, but because he assumed it was important, or that it wasn't related to the rest. But because it existed outside of that system, It wasn't affected by the changes he had made. Marcus didn't react right away. He was silent for longer than usual, not the kind of silence where you wait for the other person to continue, but the kind of silence when someone realizes they've missed a critical detail. The certainty in his eyes was gone. He didn't deny it, nor did he confirm it. He just looked at me as if he were recalculating everything he thought was already done. I didn't need to add what that meant. He understood. What he had arranged wasn't wrong. It just wasn't enough. And in a system where everything depends on completing each step, as long as one step remained open, the entire outcome would no longer be what was originally planned. From his perspective, everything was almost simple. But almost isn't done. And with just one part left unfinished, the plan he thought was complete suddenly became much more fragile. I didn't stay to win an argument, nor did I stay to prove who was right and who was wrong. When everything was clear, the only thing left was to decide what I would do with the rest of my life. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I didn't try to break things even more just to feel like I had reacted strongly enough. Just said I needed time, and this time, it wasn't a way to stall. It was a decision. The days that followed were very orderly. My lawyer helped me sort out what needed to be kept and what needed to be separated. Accounts were closed or converted. Documents were updated according to the condition that had previously been unfulfilled. I didn't work fast, but I was thorough. There was no more room for ambiguity. Marcus didn't show up much after that. When he was around, he said less. No more long explanations, no more assurances that everything would be fine. Maybe he understood that some things, once seen clearly, can never go back to the way they were. I left that house on a very ordinary morning. There was no dramatic scene, just a few boxes, a suitcase, and the things I chose to take with me. The rest, I left right where it was, not because I didn't need it, but because I no longer wanted to carry things that didn't truly belong to me. My new life didn't begin with a big turning point. It began with very small things. A new place to live, a new desk, a morning where I didn't have to check who was handling what behind my back. I still make coffee every morning. I still let it cool a bit while I read my emails. But this time, nothing was overlooked without being looked at again. I didn't lose everything. It was just the first time I truly understood what was actually mine. And sometimes, the most important thing isn't getting back what you've lost, but to stop handing over the remaining pieces of your life to people who don't deserve them. People don't leave on the day everything collapses. They leave on the day they understand how things were all along. If you've listened this far, you might recognize something very familiar in this story. Not everyone goes through the same things, but that feeling of overlooking something, of reassuring yourself to keep things peaceful. Almost everyone has felt that. This story isn't about who was right or wrong. It's a gentle reminder that some things in life don't disappear all at once. They leave, little by little, in the very small choices that sometimes we ourselves don't even notice. If there's one thing you want to take away for yourself from this story, perhaps it's to spend a little more time looking back. Looking back at the things you believe in, the things you're accepting, and the questions you once ignored. If you found this story meaningful, you can leave a thought of your own. It doesn't have to be long, just real. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so we can see more clearly together the things we've grown accustomed to not seeing. Thank you for staying until the end.